I'm Jake Thompson, and I'll never forget the moment I opened my eyes in that sterile hospital room at Piedmont General, the steady beeping of machines surrounding me like a symphony of survival. But instead of calling for help, instead of letting the nurses know I was awake, I made a decision that would change everything. I stayed perfectly still, controlling my breathing, keeping my heart rate steady, and pretended to remain unconscious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 2 weeks, I became a ghost in my own body, listening to conversations that were never meant for my ears. What I heard my own family planning while they thought I couldn't hear them shattered every belief I had about love, loyalty, and blood ties. When I finally revealed the truth in the most devastating way possible, watching their faces crumble as they realized what they had done, I knew there was no going back. You see, lying there motionless while your mother discusses whether your business would be worth more if you never woke up teaches you things about human nature that no university course ever could. If you discovered your family's true intentions while they believed you were unconscious, would you forgive them for the sake of keeping the peace, or would you make them face the consequences of their betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever had to make an impossible choice about family loyalty versus justice. It all started 3 weeks before I found myself in that hospital bed, playing dead while my family planned my professional funeral. I had just walked out of a gleaming office building in Midtown Atlanta, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the contract that would change everything. $15 million. My cybersecurity firm, SecureEdge Technologies, had just landed the biggest government contract in the company's 5-year history. The Department of Defense had chosen us over industry giants, recognizing the breakthrough AI security protocols I had spent countless sleepless nights developing. At 32 years old, I had built something from nothing, transforming a small consulting business run out of my apartment into a thriving company with 25 employees and offices on the 14th floor of one of Atlanta's premier business towers. The Georgia sun felt different that day as I drove through Buckhead toward my family's suburban home, the leather seat of my car warm against my back, the contract folder resting on the passenger seat like a treasure chest. I had worked 16-hour days for months to secure this deal, flying back and forth to Washington, D.C., presenting to military officials who held the future of American cybersecurity in their hands. Every line of code I had written, every security vulnerability I had identified and patched, every innovative solution I had proposed had led to this moment. I wasn't just successful anymore, I was genuinely wealthy, and for the first time in my adult life, I thought my family might finally see me as something other than the risky dreamer who had disappointed them by choosing entrepreneurship over a traditional career path. Growing up in the Thompson household had always meant navigating the careful balance between my parents' expectations and my own ambitions. My older brother Kevin had followed the prescribed path perfectly, earning his MBA and climbing the corporate ladder at one of Atlanta's largest banks, eventually becoming a senior vice president with a corner office and a salary that made my parents beam with pride at dinner parties. My younger sister Ashley had chosen the noble route of education, becoming a beloved elementary school teacher whose classroom walls were covered with thank you cards from grateful students and their parents. Both of them had married within their social circles, produced grandchildren on schedule, and bought houses in the same upscale neighborhoods where we had grown up. Then there was me, Jake Thompson, the family outlier, who had dropped out of his master's program to start a business that most people couldn't even understand. Cybersecurity sounded like science fiction to my parents, who still asked me to help them reset their email passwords and couldn't comprehend how someone could make a living protecting computers from invisible threats. For years, they had watched me struggle through the early days of SecureEdge, working from a cramped apartment, eating ramen noodles for dinner, and turning down their offers of financial help because I was determined to succeed on my own terms. They had endured my failed pitches, my rejected proposals, and my near-bankruptcy moments with the patience of parents watching a child insist on touching a hot stove to learn it burns. But that had all changed 6 months earlier when Fortune magazine featured SecureEdge in their annual list of America's fastest-growing private companies. Suddenly, my parents' friends were asking about their son, the tech entrepreneur, and dinner conversations shifted from concerned inquiries about my financial stability to proud boasts about my innovative work protecting major corporations from cyber attacks. The invitations to family gatherings increased, my opinions on technology matters were suddenly valued, and I noticed my brother and sister paying closer attention to my business updates during our monthly family dinners. The $15 million contract represented more than just financial security, it was validation that my unconventional path had been worth every sacrifice. I imagined walking into my parents' living room and watching their faces light up as I shared the news, finally earning the unconditional pride I had craved since childhood. My father, who had spent years suggesting I should consider a more stable career, would have to admit that his youngest son had built something remarkable. My mother, who had worried constantly about my financial future, could finally relax knowing I had achieved the kind of success that would last a lifetime. As I pulled into the circular driveway of my childhood home, a stately colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping that reflected my parents' attention to appearances, I felt a surge of anticipation mixed with nervous energy. The house looked exactly as it had throughout my teenage years, with its red brick facade, white columns, and the same dogwood tree I had climbed as a boy, now towering over the front yard with branches that scraped against my old bedroom window during storms. The familiar sight usually brought comfort, but today it felt charged with possibility, as if the building itself was waiting to witness a moment of transformation. I found my family gathered in the spacious kitchen that had always served as the heart of the Thompson household, where major announcements were made and important conversations took place around the granite island that my mother had installed during a renovation 5 years earlier. Linda Thompson looked up from the stack of mail she was sorting, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, silver hair styled in the same elegant bob she had maintained for decades. At 58, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had successfully raised 3 children and managed a household that served as the social center for their circle of friends. My father Bob sat at the breakfast table with his laptop open, reviewing what appeared to be financial documents with the methodical attention to detail that had made him successful during his career as an insurance executive. At 61, retirement suited him well, giving him time to pursue his passion for golf and his meticulous management of the family's investment portfolio. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he wore the kind of casual polo shirt and khakis that had become his uniform since leaving the corporate world 2 years earlier. Ashley was there with her husband Derek, their 2 young children playing quietly in the adjacent family room under the watchful eye of my brother Kevin, who had apparently stopped by after work, his business suit slightly wrinkled from a long day at the bank. The scene felt perfectly normal, a typical Thursday evening gathering that had become more common since I started achieving real success, but I was too excited to notice the subtle tension in the air, the way conversations paused just a moment too long when I entered, the glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I held up the contract folder with a grin that probably made me look like a lottery winner, which in many ways I was. "I did it," I announced, my voice carrying the kind of joy that comes from years of hard work finally paying off. $15 million over 3 years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The Department of Defense just made SecureEdge their primary cybersecurity contractor for the Southeast region. I expected cheers, maybe even applause, certainly the kind of enthusiastic celebration that had greeted Kevin's promotion to Senior Vice President or Ashley's Teacher of the Year award. Instead, the kitchen fell into a silence that felt heavy and awkward, broken only by the humming of the refrigerator and the distant sound of my niece and nephew playing with their toys. My mother's expression shifted from surprise to something I couldn't quite identify, while my father closed his laptop with deliberate slowness, his attention now fully focused on me. Ashley exchanged a look with Derek that seemed to communicate something I wasn't privy to, and Kevin set down his coffee mug with the careful precision of someone buying time to choose his words. "That's wonderful, Jake," my mother finally said, but her tone lacked the warmth and excitement I had expected. $15 million is certainly a significant amount of money. The way she emphasized significant made it sound almost like an accusation rather than a celebration, as if my success was somehow problematic rather than triumphant. My father leaned back in his chair, studying me with the analytical expression he typically reserved for reviewing insurance policies or evaluating investment opportunities. "That's quite a responsibility, son," he said carefully. "Managing a contract that size, ensuring proper oversight, making sure nothing goes wrong. Have you given thought to bringing in additional partners or advisors to help shoulder that burden?" The question caught me off guard because it seemed to assume I was incapable of handling my own success, despite the fact that I had spent 5 years building SecureEdge into a company capable of winning such a significant contract. "I've got an excellent team," I replied, trying to maintain my enthusiasm despite the growing awkwardness of the conversation. "We've been preparing for this kind of expansion, and our security protocols are already being implemented across 3 other government agencies. The Pentagon specifically chose us because of our track record and innovation." Kevin spoke up from his position near the family room entrance, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had developed during his years in banking. "The thing is, Jake, individual success is one thing, but when you're talking about this level of money and responsibility, it becomes a family matter. We all have a stake in seeing you succeed, and more importantly in making sure you don't fail in a way that could impact all of us." I stared at my brother, confused by his logic and frustrated by the implication that my business achievements were somehow a family concern rather than a personal accomplishment. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by family matter," I said, my voice betraying the first hint of irritation. "This is my company, my contract, my responsibility. I've never asked for family involvement in business decisions before, and I don't need it now." Ashley stepped forward, her teacher voice activated in the way she used when explaining difficult concepts to students who weren't grasping the lesson. "What Kevin means is that success like this comes with obligations," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've always been the independent one, Jake, but now that you've achieved something this significant, maybe it's time to think about how your good fortune can benefit the people who supported you along the way." The word supported hung in the air like a challenge, and I found myself reviewing years of family interactions, trying to remember specific instances of support for my entrepreneurial journey. What I recalled instead were countless suggestions that I pursue more traditional career paths, expressions of concern about my financial stability, and subtle but persistent implications that my chosen profession was somehow less valuable than my siblings' more conventional choices. "I appreciate everything you've all done for me," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully to avoid escalating the tension that was building in the room, "but I'm not sure what specific support you're referring to. I started SecureEdge with my own savings, built the client base through my own networking and expertise, and took on all the financial risk myself. The success belongs to me and my employees who worked to earn it." Derek, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since I had arrived. "The thing is, Jake, family isn't just about direct financial investment, it's about emotional support, encouragement, providing a foundation that allows someone to take risks. Without the stability of knowing your family was behind you, would you have been able to focus completely on building your business?" The question felt like a trap, designed to make me acknowledge some debt I didn't remember incurring, but before I could respond, my mother interjected with the kind of gentle but firm tone she had used when settling disputes between her children during our teenage years. "What everyone is trying to say, sweetheart, is that we think it might be wise to consider how this windfall could benefit the entire family. Ashley and Derek are struggling with their mortgage payments, Kevin's children will need college funds, and your father and I could use some additional security for our retirement years. The word windfall struck me like a physical blow because it implied that my success was the result of luck rather than years of dedicated work, strategic planning, and calculated risks. I looked around the kitchen at the faces of people I had loved and trusted my entire life, searching for some indication that they understood what they were asking of me, but all I saw was expectation and a strange sense of entitlement that made my stomach turn. "You want me to share my business profits with you?" I said, not as a question but as a statement of the obvious truth underlying their carefully worded suggestions. "You think because we're family, my success automatically becomes everyone's financial opportunity." The directness of my statement seemed to catch them off guard, as if they had expected me to gradually come around to their way of thinking without forcing them to state their intentions so bluntly. Ashley's face flushed slightly, and she glanced at our parents as if seeking permission to continue the conversation. "It's not about taking anything from you," Kevin said, his banker's training evident in the way he framed the discussion in terms of mutual benefit rather than one-sided obligation. "It's about smart financial planning and family investment. You could bring us in as limited partners, give us equity stakes that reflect our contributions to your foundation, and we could provide oversight and guidance to help ensure the longevity of your success." The phrase "our contributions to your foundation" was so vague and presumptuous that I almost laughed, but the seriousness of their expressions told me this was not a casual suggestion born from momentary greed, but rather a plan they had discussed and developed before my arrival. They had been waiting for my success, preparing for this conversation, ready to claim their share of achievements they had not earned. "Let me make sure I understand," I said, my voice growing cold despite my efforts to remain calm. "You want me to give you equity in my company, share profits from contracts I negotiated, and accept your oversight and guidance for a business you've never shown interest in understanding, in exchange for emotional support you provided as family members, which I thought was given freely rather than as an investment requiring return." The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt charged with anger and resentment rather than mere awkwardness. I could see my family members exchanging glances, communicating in the subtle language of people who had discussed this scenario extensively, and were now realizing their approach was not working as planned. My father stood up from the breakfast table, his posture straight and his expression serious in the way that had always preceded major parental decisions during my childhood. "Jake, I think you're misunderstanding the situation," he said with the authority of someone accustomed to being the final word in family matters. "We're not asking for handouts or trying to take advantage of your success. We're offering to help you manage responsibilities that might be too much for one person to handle alone." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, the implication that I was somehow incapable of managing my own achievements, and I felt the last of my patience evaporating like steam from a boiling pot. "Too much for me to handle," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to maintain control. "I've been handling it just fine for 5 years. I've grown the company from nothing to 25 employees, won contracts with some of the largest corporations in America, and now secured the biggest government deal in our industry's history. What exactly makes you think I need help now?" Ashley stepped forward again, her hands raised in the universal gesture of someone trying to calm a volatile situation, but her words had the opposite effect. "We're just concerned that success might go to your head," she said with the kind of false concern that barely masked her real motivations. "We've seen what happens to people who suddenly come into money without proper guidance. We don't want you to make mistakes that could hurt not just you but all of us by association." The phrase "success might go to your head" was the breaking point, the moment when years of subtle family dynamics crystallized into clarity. They weren't offering help or expressing concern, they were positioning themselves to benefit from my achievements while simultaneously suggesting I was unworthy of them. They wanted my money but not my autonomy, my success but not my independence. "By association," I said, standing up from my chair with enough force that it scraped against the tile floor. "How exactly would my business decisions hurt you by association? You've never been involved in Secure Edge, never taken any financial risk, never contributed anything beyond the basic support that family members give each other. What association are you worried about?" Derek, emboldened perhaps by the escalating confrontation, decided to join the attack with the bluntness of someone who felt he had nothing to lose. The association of being related to someone who thinks $15 million makes him better than the people who raised him, he said, his voice carrying a spite that revealed the true nature of their frustration. The association of having a brother-in-law who forgets where he came from the minute he gets a little money. The accusation was so unfair and unfounded that it left me speechless for a moment, not because I was considering its validity, but because I was stunned by the depth of resentment it revealed. These people, my own family, had somehow convinced themselves that my refusal to share my business profits with them was evidence of arrogance and ingratitude rather than basic financial common sense. "A little money," I said, finding my voice again. "Is that what you think this is? Do you have any idea what it took to build SecureEdge? Do you know how many nights I worked until dawn writing code, how many presentations I gave to skeptical clients, how many times I risked everything on decisions that could have destroyed the company? This isn't lottery winnings or an inheritance, it's the result of years of work that you never bothered to understand or appreciate." My mother, who had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, finally intervened with the kind of maternal authority that had always been able to stop arguments between her children. "That's enough," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Jake, I think you need to take some time to consider what's really important here. Money comes and goes, but family is forever. Don't let success make you forget that." The statement felt like a betrayal wrapped in wisdom, a manipulation disguised as motherly advice, and I realized that Linda Thompson, the woman who had taught me about kindness and generosity, was actively participating in an attempt to guilt me into surrendering my financial independence. The disappointment was crushing, but it was also clarifying, revealing the true nature of family loyalty when it conflicted with financial self-interest. "What's really important," I said slowly, looking around the kitchen at the faces of people who suddenly felt like strangers, "is that my own family thinks my success obligates me to support them financially, while simultaneously suggesting I'm too arrogant and incompetent to manage that success alone. What's really important is that instead of celebrating my achievements, you've turned them into evidence of my selfishness." I picked up the contract folder from the counter where I had placed it with such hope just minutes earlier, the document that had represented validation and family pride now feeling like a burden that had exposed uncomfortable truths about the people I loved most. "I think I need some air," I announced, heading toward the kitchen door that led to the back patio, hoping that a few minutes outside might help me process what had just happened. But Kevin blocked my path, his face flushed with anger and frustration, his banker's composure completely abandoned. "You think you can just walk away from this conversation?" he demanded. "You think you can dismiss your family's concerns and pretend we're being unreasonable? I think I can leave my family's house when a conversation becomes hostile," I replied, trying to step around him, but he moved to block me again, his body language aggressive in a way I had never seen before. "Hostile?" Ashley laughed bitterly. "We're trying to help you, Jake. We're trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life, and you're calling us hostile." The word "save" was the final insult, the suggestion that my desire to maintain control over my own business was somehow self-destructive behavior requiring intervention. I looked at my sister, remembering the little girl who used to ask me to read her bedtime stories, and wondered how we had reached this point where my success was seen as a problem rather than an accomplishment. "Save me from what?" I asked. "From being successful? From achieving financial independence? From proving that my unconventional career choice was the right decision? What exactly do you think you're saving me from?" "From losing your family," my father said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of an ultimatum disguised as a warning. "From choosing money over the people who love you." The threat was clear, though wrapped in the language of concern and conditional love: submit to their financial demands, or face rejection and isolation from the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally. It was emotional blackmail of the most sophisticated kind, designed to make me question my own judgment and prioritize their wants over my needs. I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the people who had shaped my childhood and influenced my values, and realized that I was facing the most important decision of my adult life. I could surrender to their demands, accept their framework that family obligation included financial obligation, and maintain relationships built on resentment and manipulation. Or I could stand my ground, accept the consequences of their disappointment, and preserve the integrity of achievements I had earned through my own efforts. The choice should have been obvious, but the pain of family rejection made it feel impossible. These were the people who had attended my high school graduation, celebrated my college acceptance, worried about my health during stressful periods, and provided the foundation of love and security that had given me the confidence to take entrepreneurial risks. The thought of losing them felt like contemplating amputation of a vital organ, necessary for survival but devastating beyond description. "I love you all," I said finally, my voice heavy with sadness and disappointment. "But I won't be manipulated or blackmailed into sharing my business with people who see my success as their opportunity rather than my achievement. If that makes me selfish in your eyes, then I guess I'll have to live with your disappointment." I moved toward the door again, and this time Kevin didn't try to block my path, though his expression made it clear that my decision was being interpreted as a declaration of war rather than a boundary-setting exercise. As I reached for the handle, Ashley's voice followed me with words that would haunt me for weeks to come. "Don't expect us to be here when you realize how wrong you are," she called out, her teacher's voice now cold and final. "Don't think you can come back to this family when your money doesn't keep you warm at night." I paused at the threshold, hand on the door, considering whether to respond to her threat with anger or sadness, but ultimately deciding that nothing I could say would change their perspective or repair the damage that had been done to our relationships. Instead, I walked out into the Georgia evening, the humid air thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the promise of an approaching storm. The drive back to my apartment in Virginia Highland should have been a time for reflection and emotional processing, but instead I found myself consumed with anger at the injustice of their demands and disappointment at their willingness to sacrifice family harmony for financial gain. The streets of Atlanta blurred past my windows as I navigated traffic on autopilot, my mind replaying the confrontation and analyzing every word, gesture, and implication. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, the storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke, sending sheets of rain across the city and turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon light. I sat in my car for several minutes, listening to the rain pound against the roof and watching lightning illuminate the sky, trying to process what had just happened and wondering if there was any way to repair the damage to my family relationships. But even as I hoped for reconciliation, I knew that something fundamental had changed in that kitchen, something that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. My family had revealed their true priorities, and I had revealed mine, and those priorities were apparently incompatible with maintaining the kind of close relationships we had always claimed to value. I gathered my things and ran through the rain to the building entrance, my contract folder clutched against my chest like a shield, the document that was supposed to represent triumph, now feeling like evidence in a case I hadn't wanted to make. As I rode the elevator to my floor, water dripping from my clothes onto the polished floor, I wondered if this was what success really looked like. Achieving your dreams while losing the people you wanted to share them with. The evening that had started with such promise, such hope for family celebration and shared joy, had ended with ultimatums and threats, revealing fault lines in relationships I had thought were solid. And as I unlocked the door to my apartment, stepping into the quiet space that suddenly felt more lonely than peaceful, I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Part 2. The Crash and Awakening. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally unleashed its fury as I drove through the winding roads of Buckhead, my hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity while my mind raced through the devastating conversation that had just shattered my understanding of family loyalty. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour, creating brief moments of clarity before the glass was obscured again by sheets of water that transformed the familiar streets into an alien landscape of distorted lights and shadows. I had driven these roads thousands of times during my 32 years in Atlanta, navigating them in every weather condition and time of day, but tonight felt different, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the storm, and everything to do with the emotional turmoil consuming my thoughts. The confrontation with my family had left me feeling disoriented and betrayed, as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted without warning, revealing chasms I never knew existed. The radio played softly in the background, some generic pop song that provided a stark contrast to the chaos in my head, where I kept replaying Ashley's final words about not expecting them to be there when I realized how wrong I was. The certainty in her voice had been chilling, suggesting that this wasn't a momentary disagreement that could be resolved with time and perspective, but rather a fundamental shift in our family dynamics that would have lasting consequences. As I turned onto Peachtree Road, heading toward my apartment in Virginia Highland, a text message notification chimed from my phone, which was sitting in the cup holder beside me. Against my better judgment, I glanced down at the screen and saw my girlfriend Samantha's name, followed by a preview of text that made my stomach drop. "Jake, we need to talk about us. I heard about what happened at dinner." The realization that news of the family confrontation had already reached Samantha, presumably through Ashley, who had always maintained a close friendship with her, felt like another betrayal layered on top of an already devastating evening. How much had my sister shared, and what spin had she put on the events to make me look like the villain in a story where I had simply refused to be manipulated and controlled? I reached for the phone to read the complete message, taking my eyes off the road for what couldn't have been more than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. When I looked up, I saw the massive oak tree directly ahead of me, its ancient trunk appearing in my headlights, like a wall of certain destruction. I had drifted across the center line while distracted, and now physics was about to deliver a lesson in the consequences of divided attention. Time seemed to slow down in that final moment before impact, allowing me to experience each millisecond with crystal clarity. I could see the rough texture of the oak's bark, smell the ozone from the lightning that had been illuminating the sky, feel the inadequate grip of my tires on the rain-slicked asphalt as I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right in a desperate attempt to avoid collision. But momentum and velocity are unforgiving forces, and my car continued its trajectory toward the tree with the inevitability of a mathematical equation solving itself. The impact was explosive, a symphony of crushing metal and shattering glass that seemed to go on forever while actually lasting only a few seconds. My airbag deployed with violent force, slamming into my chest and face with enough power to prevent death while inflicting its own catalog of injuries. The world spun around me in a kaleidoscope of pain and confusion, punctuated by the hiss of escaping steam and the metallic groaning of a vehicle that had been transformed from transportation into twisted sculpture. Then there was silence, broken only by the steady patter of rain on what remained of my windshield and the ticking sound of cooling metal. I tried to move, to assess the damage to my body, but everything felt disconnected and wrong, as if my brain was sending signals that weren't reaching their intended destinations. Pain radiated from multiple points on my body, but it felt distant and unreal, like sensation filtered through layers of gauze. I could hear voices approaching, people who had witnessed the accident or been drawn by the sound of destruction, their words floating toward me through the rain but lacking coherence or meaning. Someone was asking if I was okay, another voice was calling for an ambulance, and I wanted to respond, to participate in my own rescue, but the effort required more energy than I could summon. The next thing I remember was the sensation of movement, of being lifted and transported, surrounded by urgent voices speaking in medical terminology that I couldn't quite grasp. Paramedics were working on me with professional efficiency, checking vital signs and establishing intravenous lines while discussing my condition in the clinical language of emergency medicine. I tried to speak, to tell them about the pain in my head and the numbness in my limbs, but the words wouldn't form properly, emerging as unintelligible sounds that conveyed desperation but no information. The ambulance ride to Piedmont General was a blur of sirens and flashing lights, punctuated by medical procedures I couldn't see but could feel as distant manipulations of my uncooperative body. The paramedics worked with calm urgency, their practiced hands performing assessments and treatments, while their voices provided a steady stream of updates to the hospital staff who would be receiving me. In the emergency room, I became the center of controlled chaos as doctors and nurses swarmed around my gurney, their movements choreographed by years of trauma experience. Bright lights overhead made my head pound with increased intensity, and the constant beeping of monitoring equipment created a soundtrack that would become sickeningly familiar over the coming weeks. Medical personnel called out numbers and abbreviations while X-ray machines and CT scanners mapped the damage that the oak tree had inflicted on my skull and spine. Dr. Patricia Kim, a neurologist with kind eyes and steady hands, became the first medical professional to speak directly to me rather than about me, explaining that I had suffered severe head trauma and would need to be placed in a medically induced coma to allow my brain to heal without the stress of consciousness. Her voice was gentle but authoritative, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to patients and families who weren't prepared to hear it. "We're going to take very good care of you," she said, her hand resting briefly on my arm in a gesture of reassurance that penetrated the fog of pain medication. "Your family is being contacted and they'll be here soon. Right now you need to focus on healing, and we're going to help your brain do that by giving it the rest it needs." The mention of my family sent a jolt of complicated emotions through my compromised nervous system, combining anticipation with dread as I wondered how they would react to news of my accident so soon after our devastating confrontation. Would they see this as divine justice for my refusal to share my business success, or would the crisis bring out the protective instincts that I hoped still existed beneath their financial demands? As the anesthesia began to take effect, pulling me down into artificial unconsciousness, my last coherent thought was a prayer that this experience might somehow reset our family relationships, that the shock of nearly losing me would help my parents and siblings remember what truly mattered in life. I clung to the hope that when I woke up, we could start over with a better understanding of love, loyalty, and the difference between supporting someone and exploiting them. But consciousness, when it returned 7 days later, brought with it an opportunity I hadn't expected, and a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about the people who shared my DNA. I opened my eyes in the intensive care unit of Piedmont General, surrounded by the now familiar symphony of medical equipment, but instead of calling for help, or announcing my return to consciousness, I made a decision that would prove to be the most important choice of my life. Something about the quality of silence in the room, the way shadows fell across the walls, and the distant sound of conversation from the hallway told me that I was alone, unobserved by medical staff who might notice the change in my condition. Dr. Kim had explained, during one of her bedside consultations that I had overheard through the haze of sedation, that they would be gradually reducing my medication and monitoring my responses, looking for signs that my brain had healed sufficiently to support normal consciousness. I realized that I had been given an unprecedented opportunity to observe my family and friends in their natural state, without the performance and pretense that typically accompanies hospital visits. They would speak freely around my unconscious form, revealing their true thoughts and feelings about my condition, my future, and the business success that had caused such controversy just days before my accident. The decision to maintain the pretense of unconsciousness required immediate and careful implementation, demanding that I control not only my obvious responses like movement and speech, but also the subtle indicators that medical professionals use to assess consciousness. I had to keep my breathing patterns consistent with someone in a coma, avoid the rapid eye movements that might suggest awareness, and most challengingly, resist the natural urge to react to sounds, voices, and physical stimuli. My first test came within minutes of making this decision, when I heard the distinctive sound of my mother's heels clicking against the hospital floor as she approached my room, accompanied by the heavier footsteps of my father and the softer steps of what I assumed were my siblings. They entered quietly, their voices hushed in the way people instinctively modify their behavior in medical environments, but I could hear them gathering around my bed with the nervous energy of people unsure how to behave in a crisis. "He looks so pale," my mother whispered, her voice carrying the kind of maternal concern that had comforted me through childhood illnesses and injuries. For a moment, hearing that familiar tone of protective worry, I felt a surge of love and gratitude that made me want to abandon my deception and reassure her that I was going to be okay. But something in the pause that followed, the way the room fell silent after her observation, kept me motionless and alert. "The doctors say he's stable," my father responded, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when discussing serious matters. "Dr. Kim explained that the coma is medically induced, designed to give his brain time to heal from the trauma. She's optimistic about his recovery, though she mentioned there could be some cognitive effects that won't be apparent until he wakes up." The phrase cognitive effects hung in the air like a question mark, and I sensed rather than saw the meaningful glances being exchanged around my bed. There was something in the way my father had emphasized those words that suggested they carried significance beyond their medical meaning, as if they represented an opportunity rather than a concern. Ashley's voice joined the conversation, carefully modulated to convey appropriate sisterly worry, while carrying undertones that made my skin crawl. "It's just so tragic," she said, and I could picture her shaking her head with practiced sorrow. "He was so excited about that government contract, so convinced that his success meant he didn't need family support or guidance. And now this happens, just when he needed to be most careful and responsible." The implication in her words was clear: my accident was somehow connected to my refusal to share my business with them, a form of cosmic justice that proved their warnings about the dangers of individual success. She was rewriting the narrative of our confrontation, transforming their financial demands into prescient concerns about my ability to handle responsibility. Kevin's voice added another layer to their developing story, his banker's instincts already calculating the opportunities presented by my condition. "The timing couldn't be worse from a business perspective," he said with false regret. "SecureEdge has this massive government contract starting next month, and Jake's the only one who fully understands the technical requirements and security protocols. If there are cognitive effects from the head injury, if he can't return to full capacity, that $15 million deal could be in jeopardy." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning as I realized where this conversation was heading. They weren't discussing my welfare or recovery, they were evaluating the business implications of my condition and positioning themselves to benefit from any limitations I might face upon awakening. My father's response confirmed my growing suspicions about their motivations. "We might need to consider emergency business measures," he said, with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "If Jake's condition prevents him from fulfilling his contractual obligations, someone needs to step in to protect the company and preserve the value of that government deal. As his family, we have both the obligation and the legal standing to act in his best interests." The phrase legal standing sent alarm bells ringing in my head as I realized they were already thinking about power of attorney arrangements and guardianship proceedings that would give them control over my business affairs. They had spent less than 10 minutes in my hospital room, and they were already planning how to exploit my condition for their financial benefit. Derek's voice joined the discussion, carrying the enthusiasm of someone who saw opportunity in tragedy. "Ashley's already reached out to some of Jake's key clients," he announced proudly, as if his wife's initiative deserved praise rather than condemnation. "She's been explaining the situation and reassuring them that the family is committed to maintaining continuity of service during Jake's recovery period." The revelation that Ashley had been contacting my clients without my knowledge or permission was so outrageous that I nearly abandoned my deception to confront her directly. Secure Edge's client relationships were built on trust, technical expertise, and personal relationships that I had cultivated over years of dedicated service. The idea that my sister, who had never shown any interest in understanding cybersecurity or technology, was representing herself as a family spokesperson to my professional contacts was both presumptuous and potentially damaging to the company's reputation. But I forced myself to remain motionless, recognizing that this conversation was providing invaluable insight into their true intentions and long-term plans. If I revealed my consciousness now, they would simply adjust their approach and become more careful about discussing their schemes in my presence. By maintaining the pretense of being unconscious, I could gather evidence of their conspiracy and prepare appropriate countermeasures. My mother's voice returned to the conversation, but now it carried a different quality, less maternal concern and more calculated planning. "We should probably consult with Harold Peterson about the legal options," she suggested, referring to the family attorney who had handled routine matters like wills and real estate transactions. "If Jake's cognitive abilities are compromised, we may need to establish formal guardianship arrangements to protect his assets and business interests." The speed with which they had moved from expressions of concern to discussions of legal control was breathtaking in its cynical efficiency. Less than a week had passed since our confrontation over their demands for equity in my company, and now they were using my accident as an opportunity to seize control through legal mechanisms rather than family manipulation. Kevin's response revealed the depth of their planning and preparation. "I've already had preliminary conversations with Harold," he admitted, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been proactive in protecting family interests. "He's researching the requirements for emergency guardianship proceedings, particularly in cases involving business owners who become incapacitated during critical contract negotiations." The revelation that my brother had been consulting with attorneys about taking control of my affairs while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed was so shocking that I felt my heart rate spike, threatening to trigger the monitoring equipment that would alert medical staff to my changed condition. I forced myself to use the breathing techniques I had learned during stressful business presentations, slowly and carefully regulating my physiological responses to avoid detection. Ashley's voice carried a note of excitement that she was trying unsuccessfully to disguise as concern. "Harold said that with proper documentation of Jake's cognitive impairment, we could potentially establish a conservatorship that would give us broad authority over his business decisions," she reported, apparently proud of her research into legal mechanisms for seizing control of my life's work. "The key is demonstrating that his condition prevents him from making sound financial decisions." The word conservatorship hit me like a physical blow as I realized the full scope of their intentions. They weren't just planning to help me during a temporary recovery period, they were researching ways to permanently strip me of control over my own business and financial affairs, using my medical condition as justification for what amounted to legal theft. Derek's contribution to the conversation revealed another disturbing aspect of their planning. "The beautiful thing is that conservatorships are designed to be difficult to reverse," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Once we establish that Jake's cognitive abilities have been compromised by the head trauma, the burden of proof shifts to him to demonstrate full recovery and competence. Even if he improves significantly, there would always be questions about his decision-making capacity." I realized that they were planning to trap me in a legal framework that would be nearly impossible to escape, using my own family relationships and their claimed concern for my welfare as weapons against my autonomy and independence. The accident that I had hoped might bring us together was instead being weaponized as an opportunity to achieve the financial control they had been unable to obtain through direct confrontation. My father's voice carried the tone of someone reaching a final decision. "We need to move quickly," he said with quiet determination. "The longer we wait to establish legal authority, the more complicated it becomes if Jake shows signs of recovery." Harold suggested that we begin the paperwork immediately, while his condition is clearly documented as incapacitated. The casual way he discussed manipulating legal systems to strip me of my rights, using my medical vulnerability as a tool for their financial gain, revealed a level of coldness and calculation that I had never suspected existed in the man who had raised me. This wasn't the loving father who had taught me to ride a bicycle and attended my school plays. This was a stranger wearing his face, motivated by greed and willing to exploit his own son's misfortune for monetary advantage. A new voice joined the conversation, one that I didn't immediately recognize but which carried the authority of medical expertise. Kim had entered the room, presumably to check on my condition or update my family on my progress, and I felt a surge of hope that her professional presence might interrupt their scheming and force them to remember that I was a person, not a business opportunity. "How is he doing, doctor?" my mother asked, her voice instantly transforming back into the concerned maternal tone she had abandoned during their legal discussions. The speed with which she could switch between calculating opportunist and worried mother was disturbing in its implications about her true nature. "Doctor." Kim's response was measured and professional. "His vital signs remain stable, and the brain scans show encouraging signs of healing," she explained. "We're gradually reducing the sedation medication, and I expect to see some signs of consciousness within the next few days. However, it's important to understand that recovery from head trauma can be unpredictable, and we won't know the extent of any cognitive effects until he's fully awake." I could sense the heightened attention from my family members as they absorbed this information, no doubt calculating how the doctor's timeline affected their legal maneuvering. The knowledge that I might regain consciousness soon was probably accelerating their plans to establish control before I could defend myself. Kevin's voice carried studied casualness as he probed for information that could support their legal strategy. "When you mention cognitive effects, what specifically should we be watching for?" he asked. "Are we talking about memory problems, decision-making difficulties, personality changes?" Dr. Kim's response was clinically precise. "Head trauma can affect various aspects of cognitive function," she explained. "Some patients experience memory gaps, particularly around the time of their injury. Others might have difficulty with complex reasoning, impulse control, or executive functions like planning and organizing. In severe cases, there can be personality changes or impaired judgment that affects their ability to make sound decisions." I realized that Dr. Kim was unknowingly providing my family with a roadmap for manufacturing evidence of cognitive impairment, giving them the medical terminology and diagnostic criteria they would need to support their conservatorship petition. Every symptom she described could be subjectively interpreted and exaggerated to paint a picture of someone unfit to manage their own affairs. Ashley's response revealed how quickly she was processing this information for strategic purposes. "So even if he seems to recover physically, there could be subtle cognitive problems that aren't immediately obvious?" she asked, her teacher's instincts helping her understand how to frame questions for maximum informational value. "That's correct," Dr. Kim confirmed. "Some cognitive effects can be quite subtle initially, appearing as difficulty with complex tasks or poor judgment in challenging situations. It's one of the reasons why we recommend gradual reintegration into demanding activities like work responsibilities, particularly for patients in high-stress professions." The doctor's well-intentioned advice about gradual reintegration was being absorbed by my family as justification for keeping me away from my own business, preventing me from participating in the critical decisions that would determine Secure Edge's future. They were already constructing a narrative in which any attempt I made to resume control of my company would be evidence of impaired judgment and cognitive dysfunction. My father seized on this opening with the skill of someone who had spent decades in business negotiations. "Given the complexity of Jake's work and the critical nature of his current contracts, would you recommend that someone else handle his business responsibilities during the recovery period?" he asked, framing the question as concern for my welfare rather than desire for control. Dr. Kim's response was exactly what they had hoped to hear. For someone in Jake's position, with significant business responsibilities and financial decisions to make, I would definitely recommend having trusted family members or advisors handle those matters until his cognitive function can be fully assessed, she said. The stress of trying to manage complex business affairs too early in the recovery process could actually hinder healing and potentially worsen any cognitive effects. I could practically hear the mental note-taking as my family absorbed this professional recommendation, which they would undoubtedly use to support their legal petition for control over my affairs. Dr. Kim was unknowingly providing them with expert medical opinion that would make their conservatorship application nearly impossible to challenge. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with my family asking carefully crafted questions designed to elicit responses that would support their legal strategy while maintaining the pretense of loving concern. They inquired about the likelihood of permanent cognitive impairment, the typical timeline for recovery assessment, and the criteria used to determine when someone with head trauma should be allowed to resume independent decision-making. Throughout this medical consultation, that was actually a fact-finding mission for their legal assault on my autonomy, I lay perfectly still, controlling every aspect of my physiological responses, while my mind raced with the implications of what I was hearing. The people who were supposed to protect and support me during my most vulnerable moments were instead using my condition as an opportunity to seize control of everything I had worked to build. When Dr. Kim finally left the room, promising to update them on any changes in my condition, my family's conversation immediately returned to their planning and strategizing. The mask of concern was discarded as quickly as it had been put on, revealing the calculating opportunists who had been hiding beneath the performance of familial devotion. Perfect, Kevin said with satisfaction. Harold will love having a medical opinion supporting our position. With Dr. Kim's recommendation that family members handle his business affairs, and her acknowledgement that cognitive effects might not be immediately obvious, we have everything we need to justify emergency guardianship. Ashley's voice carried the excitement of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. And the best part is that even if he recovers more quickly than expected, we'll already have legal control established, she pointed out. By the time he's capable of challenging the conservatorship, we'll have had months to solidify our position and demonstrate that the business runs better under family management. The casual way she discussed manipulating legal systems to maintain control over my life's work, even after my recovery, revealed a level of premeditation that was truly chilling. This wasn't a temporary measure designed to protect my interests during incapacitation, it was a permanent seizure of power disguised as protective concern. Derek's contribution to their planning revealed another layer of their conspiracy. I've been researching the government contract requirements, he announced, apparently proud of his initiative in studying my business obligations. The Defense Department has specific protocols for contractor succession in cases of disability or incapacitation. If we can establish legal guardianship quickly enough, we should be able to maintain contract compliance while Jake recovers. The realization that Derek, who had never shown any interest in cybersecurity or technology, was studying my government contracts and positioning himself as a potential successor, was so outrageous that I nearly abandoned my deception. The arrogance required to believe that he could step into my role managing complex cybersecurity protocols for the Department of Defense was matched only by the audacity of planning to do so without my knowledge or consent. My mother's voice brought their discussion back to immediate tactical considerations. We need to be very careful about how we present this to Jake when he wakes up, she said, her tone suggesting that they had already discussed this aspect of their strategy. He needs to believe that we're acting in his best interests, that family management of the business is temporary and protective rather than permanent and self-serving. The calculation inherent in her words, the careful consideration of how to manipulate me emotionally while legally stripping me of my rights, revealed a woman I had never known existed beneath the loving mother facade. She was planning to lie to my face about their intentions, while simultaneously working to ensure that I would have no legal recourse to stop them. Kevin's response showed that they had thought through multiple scenarios for my potential reactions. If he resists or becomes suspicious, we can always point to his emotional volatility as evidence of cognitive impairment, he suggested. Anyone who opposes reasonable family assistance for their own welfare is obviously not thinking clearly. The circular logic was breathtaking in its cynical efficiency. Any attempt I made to defend myself or resist their control would be used as proof that I needed their control, creating an inescapable trap that would justify whatever actions they chose to take. They had constructed a framework in which my autonomy itself would be evidence of my incompetence. Ashley added another disturbing element to their psychological manipulation strategy. We should also emphasize how much stress and responsibility we're taking off his shoulders, she suggested. Frame it as a gift rather than a seizure of control. Make him grateful for our sacrifice in managing his burdensome business affairs. The idea that they would try to make me feel guilty for objecting to their theft, that they would present their seizure of my life's work as a favor I should appreciate, revealed a level of psychological manipulation that was truly sociopathic in its sophistication. They weren't just planning to steal from me, they were planning to make me thank them for it. As their conversation continued, I realized that I was witnessing something unprecedented, a real-time conspiracy by my own family to exploit my medical vulnerability for financial gain. Every word they spoke was evidence of their criminal intent, every plan they discussed was documentation of their betrayal, and every strategy they developed was proof of their willingness to destroy my life for their own benefit. The knowledge that I was gathering would prove invaluable in the legal battles that were surely coming, but the emotional cost of hearing my own family discuss me as if I were a business asset to be acquired rather than a person to be loved was almost unbearable. The people who had raised me, who knew my dreams and fears and vulnerabilities, were planning to weaponize all of that intimate knowledge against me, but I forced myself to remain motionless, to continue the deception that was allowing me to document their conspiracy, in their own words. Every minute of this conversation was providing me with evidence that would be crucial in defending myself against their legal assault and protecting the business I had built from their attempted theft. As the afternoon wore on, my family continued their planning session around my supposedly unconscious form, discussing timelines and strategies with the casual efficiency of people who had no doubt about the righteousness of their cause. They were convinced that they were acting in everyone's best interests, that their control over my business would benefit the entire family while protecting me from responsibilities I was allegedly no longer capable of handling. The disconnect between their self-perception as loving protectors and the reality of their actions as calculating predators was so profound that I began to understand how people could justify almost any behavior to themselves if they framed it properly. They weren't stealing my business, they were saving it from my impaired judgment, they weren't exploiting my condition, they were shouldering burdens I could no longer carry, they weren't betraying my trust, they were protecting family interests that transcended individual desires. But I knew the truth, and I was gathering evidence that would eventually allow me to expose their conspiracy and reclaim control over my own life. The decision to maintain my deception was proving to be the most valuable choice I had ever made, providing me with insights into their true nature and advance warning of their plans that would be crucial in the battles ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.